Hey, comrades. My name is Keegan. Greetings from Brooklyn, New York, and solidarity. I'm a socialist, activist, organizer, and writer. I'm a public high school teacher here in Brooklyn, as well as a member of the Movement of Rank and File Educators, which is the progressive social justice caucus in the United Federations of Teachers, which is the local New York City teachers union, as well as a member of the Democratic Socialists of America. So I'm recorded this video today just to share with folks what is unfolding here in New York City around the city's reopening plan of the public school system, as well as to report a little bit on the organizing that's going on by teachers to resist the city's plan, to demand a safe reopening, and just some of the broader political implications for that. So just to give people a little context, and I'm going to do my best to just keep this brief and to the point. New York City has been ravaged by the COVID pandemic, much like the rest of the world. And here in New York, we've seen firsthand that the communities that have been most devastated and impacted by this pandemic have disproportionately been working class and poor communities, disproportionately Black and brown communities here in New York. I work in a neighborhood called Canarsie, Brooklyn, which was actually one of the most devastated neighborhoods in the city by the pandemic. At my school alone, every single week, we were receiving emails at the height of the pandemic of students who lost parents, aunts, uncles, caretakers, family members, friends, who died of COVID. And the same goes for our coworkers as well. So here in New York, the city has been trying to, the mayor and the chancellor of the Department of Education have been trying to push through what they call a blended reopening model, which this basically is a model where parents are presented with the option of either choosing remote learning or a blended model where it's partially in person, partially online, which sounds all nice and dandy. However, the problem is that several things. One, the problem is that schools are not being provided with any of the resources to actually make this plan a reality. So while I think it's totally understandable that parents want to send their kids back to school, all of us, teachers included, we're eager to get back into the classroom. We're eager to be working with our students. I miss my students. I miss, the relationships that I've built with my students, being able to have that face-to-face human interaction and contact with my kids. I miss it, and I think teachers do all across the city, and so do parents, and so do students. However, the reality is that the mayor and the chancellor are sending our kids back to unsafe conditions. They're sending teachers back into unsafe conditions. And they're not providing schools with any of the resources and supports they need to actually ensure a safe reopening. So just to give folks a glimpse into what that looks like, in my school, teachers returned last week to buildings that had essentially been completely abandoned and vacated by the mayor and by the Department of Education. They returned in my building to find rat feces all across the building, all across our desks, to find dead rodent carcasses, to find leaking sewage from the pipes in our ceilings, to find classrooms that were just in a state of total disrepair, to find conditions that were morally abhorrent and unacceptable. We returned to schools that were not provided with any of the protective equipment that the city promised. So teachers returned to school to find that they were provided with one mask, maybe, if they're lucky, one bottle of hand sanitizer and a small bottle of wipes. This is the protective equipment that the city supposedly promised us, right? Completely and totally insufficient to the magnitude of the crisis at hand. So even in just the past week, students haven't returned to the building. It's just faculty. In just the past week, we've seen over, I think at this point, it's close to 20 confirmed new cases of COVID in our schools in just the past week. And that's without students even returning. So we can only imagine what that's going to look like once kids actually come back into the building, right? It's going to be a complete and total disaster. And it's important to remember, kids are not coming back to schools that are joyful and full of excitement. Students are going to be returning to schools that already felt like prisons, but now even more are going to feel that reality tenfold. So students are going to be returning to schools where they're required to stay in a classroom the entire day, wear a mask the entire day, have zero physical contact or interaction with their peers or friends, where all after-school programs are going to be canceled. They're essentially going to be sitting at their desks for 6.5 hours straight, unable to get up, unable to move around, unable to have lunch with their peers. It's going to be a nightmare. It's going to be a nightmare. I mean, think of, what child, what teenager is going to want to learn in those conditions? No one. And this is happening in a reality in which the normal, what was considered normal before this, was equally unacceptable, right? It was completely morally reprehensible. So to give folks just a little bit of an insight into what this looked like in my school, where I work at in Canarsie, Brooklyn, which is a working class and low income, predominantly Black community with a large immigrant and Caribbean population. And I share this because I think the conditions in my school during normal times are reflective of the reality of most inner city public schools in New York City and all across the country. So the school that I worked at last year was my first year teaching. I consistently had 35 students in a classroom, right, as a first year teacher. Many of my students, I was teaching 10th grade, were coming to me at 5th and 6th grade reading levels. So the classroom that I was working to the first day that I stepped in, there was mold and leaking rot from the ceiling. I was working in a classroom that didn't have a working air conditioning system. And this is the normal in most classrooms. Conditions that are completely in total disrepair. In the school that I work at, most of the water fountains students are prohibited to drink from because the pipes are infested with lead, right? This is not an abnormality. This is the reality of most buildings and schools that students learn in New York City. And I say this because, and add to that, I work in a school where we don't even have a real art room. We don't have a music program. We barely have any extracurricular activities for students. So the reality is that normal wasn't working. Normal simply wasn't working. And for teachers, the truth is that we've been given an impossible task, right? So as a first year teacher, I was essentially just thrown into the lion's den. Here, best of luck, figure it out, right? With very little support, virtually zero time for collaboration with other teachers to develop best practices and effective strategies. And with virtually zero support from my administration. And to the extent that support existed, it was punitive. It was entirely focused on what I did wrong, what I didn't get right, and things of that nature. It was far from a supportive and collaborative learning environment for teachers or for students, right? So this is the reality that most New York City and inner city public school teachers are faced with across the country, right? Which is that we are working in schools and our students are learning in conditions in which our schools are not provided with the resources to succeed. Our schools are not provided with the resources to ensure that students can actually thrive and grow and learn. One small example of that is that we were provided with a restorative justice counseling program for students that was funded from an outside grant. That program has now expired. So essentially, in our entire school, students are left to work with one guidance counselor, right? So none of the kind of support services for social and emotional development and learning are being provided to kids. And this is in a community where we know our students disproportionately are dealing with the effects of trauma, of neglect, of poverty, of racism, of family separation, of abuse, of trauma. Students are not being provided with the support services they need to deal with those realities in their life. Instead, what they're given is more cops in our schools. What they're given is metal detectors when they walk into the building. Zero tolerance policies that result in a disproportionate rate of expulsion and suspension for our students who are overwhelming, if not entirely Black, brown, working class, and poor. So I say all this because this was the reality before COVID. This was what was considered normal. And I think we have to say, as teachers, as socialists, is that normal wasn't working. That in America, we have an apartheid schooling system. We have one school system that is divided by race and class. So we have two different social realities in public education. One for affluent, largely white, mostly suburban communities that have resources, that have programs, that have smaller class sizes, that have mental health counseling. And then we have then we have a reality of public education in inner city communities that is defined by chronic underfunding, that is defined by an absence of resources and supports for teachers and students, that is defined by overcrowded classrooms, that's defined by a hyper militarization and over policing in our schools. That's defined by abhorrent, morally reprehensible learning conditions for our students, conditions that in any other context, right, that no upper middle class, affluent suburban student would ever be expected to learn in, right? We can't even imagine what this would look like because it would simply never happen in affluent, predominantly white communities. But in inner city communities, in urban communities that are predominantly working class and poor, that are disproportionately black and brown, we are told that this is the normal. We are told that these are conditions we simply have to accept, right? And when we speak out about this as teachers or parents or as students, we're told that we're being unrealistic. We're told that we're causing problems, right? When in reality, the problem is the massive inequality that exists in the first place, right? An inequality in public education that is compounded and exacerbated by the inequalities that exist in our broader society, right? That are compounded by the intense segregation and inequality that exists in housing, that is compounded by the intense concentration of poverty that exists in our communities, that is compounded by the reality of mass incarceration and over-policing in inner city communities, in disproportionately working class, poor, black and brown communities. So we can't view this as an isolated issue, right? That somehow education, public education, is this separate, isolated thing. But rather, I think as socialists, we have to argue that this is part of a broader social reality of intense residential segregation, of extreme concentrations of poverty, of the over policing and militarization and incarceration of our communities, right? So we as socialists, I think, have to say that the crisis in public education is compounded with a broader social crisis in working class and poor communities, in disproportionately black and brown communities. And so I think our solution, what we have to be putting forward as socialists, also has to be multifaceted and intersectional, right? So I think as socialists, we have to be demanding, first and foremost, in our unions, that our students deserve to learn in a safe environment, right? That first of all, we need to go fully remote. That sending students into rat-infested schools with no protective equipment that are going to be overcrowded is simply unacceptable. We need a full remote model of learning for our kids to keep them safe. That is the only reasonable option that we have here, right? But that's not enough. It's not enough just to say we need fully remote learning. That's sort of obvious. We also have to say that normal wasn't working beforehand, right? Overcrowded classrooms, deteriorating physical conditions in our buildings with no ventilation, that wasn't working, right? That normal wasn't okay to begin with. And that what we really need to be demanding is a reinvestment into the future of our students, a reinvestment into public education. I think we also have to be saying that the buck doesn't stop there. We need a massive reinvestment into the communities that we work in and that we serve. We need a massive reinvestment into public, affordable, high-quality housing. We need a massive investment into public, universal health care. We need an investment into jobs and into programs for the communities that we serve. We need an investment into arts and extracurricular activities, so schools are not just a boot camp for these high stakes tests, right? We actually have to invest into the programs, into the solutions that actually allow communities to thrive and succeed, right? We have to disinvest from policing and incarceration and the systems that oppress and further marginalize the communities that we work in, and actually reinvest those resources into the services and programs that will actually keep communities safe, that will actually allow our communities to thrive and succeed. And just some specific context about here in New York, we're facing a massive budget cuts coming down the pipeline. Instead of bailing out people and communities, the Trump administration and federal governments and state governments that are in New York, predominantly run by Democrats, have essentially been left to fend for themselves, right? They've been provided little to no support. So the reality is that our schools were already in a crisis, right? And now, coming down the pipeline, we're looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in cuts to public education. The mayor is talking about laying off 9,000 public school employees, right? That is at the very same time that we are going through a pandemic where our teachers and students are living through a crisis, a traumatic experience where our communities have been devastated. The communities that we work in have been devastated by COVID. So this is a very moment where actually we need more resources in our schools, right? In my school, we just lost our entire restorative justice program that provided counseling services to students. That's insane. That is criminal. That is a criminal abandonment of our kids. So this is happening at a time where we need more counselors in schools. We need more social workers. We need more nurses. We don't even have a nurse in every building. Never mind every school. We need smaller class sizes. We need more teachers, not fewer. So I think we have to label this for what it is. This is class warfare. This is a racist attack against working class and poor communities, against Black and brown communities, and it's unacceptable. And I think what's happening in New York has given me a lot of hope in these dark and disparaging times, because teachers have taken it upon themselves to organize and resist the mayor's reckless reopening plan and to demand the schools that teachers and students deserve. So unfortunately, the union leadership in the United Federations of Teachers, New York City United Federation of Teachers, the UFT, the union leadership here has been in power for nearly 60 years. They're firmly entrenched, heavily bureaucratized, and have been completely beholden to an insider strategy that largely views the city and the politicians and administrators as people we need to play nice with, as forces that we need to collaborate with, and has pretty much entirely embraced an insider electoral strategy that emphasizes playing nice with politicians and the political establishment, and has totally abandoned and lost touch with any kind of strategy that relies on organizing the rank and file. So thankfully, though, here in New York, we've got a caucus in our union called MORE, the Movement of Rank and File Educators, which was started about 7 or 8 years ago, I believe, by a variety of socialists and radicals and union militants who came together, inspired by the successful Chicago teachers strike in 2012. And MORE has been investing a lot of time and energy over the years into trying to rebuild a fighting rank and file caucus in the union that's grounded in social justice unionism, which is essentially the idea that our unions need to fight not only for the needs of teachers, but also for the broader needs and well-being of our students and the communities that we serve, in an understanding that our working conditions as teachers is inextricably linked with the learning conditions of our students, and that what's good for teachers is good for students and parents as well. And that we need to build a union that not only organizes teachers at the rank and file chapter level, but also in tandem with that, organizes and leads a broader social justice movement for public education and for our students. And so thankfully Moore has been at the forefront of that, of organizing that effort, and they have done a lot of really impressive work in the past month to really spearhead that. And there's been a groundswell of rank and file teacher union organizing all across the city, being spearheaded by Moore. So just a couple weeks ago, they organized a conference call that had over 1,300 teachers participating in it, which is a tremendous success. And just this past week, on Monday, they organized a citywide day of action that saw teachers organizing walkouts and pickets and phone bankings and various types of actions at schools all across the city. And so I think what Moore has been doing is really a model for what it's going to take to resist the city's reckless reopening, to demand a safe and equitable reopening for students, and is really painting a picture for what it will take to win the schools that teachers and students deserve. And just a few weeks ago, the union was actually forced, because of this rank and file pressure from below, to call for the possibility of a strike and to threaten job action. Unfortunately, the union backed down at the last minute and kind of threw in the towel with this backroom deal with the mayor that kind of left us right back at square one. But I think the fact the union even felt pressured to call for a strike is a reflection of the impact that rank and file grassroots organizing has had. And I think ultimately that's what it's going to take, right? In order to win not just a safe reopening, but to win the schools that we deserve, which means saying that normal wasn't working to begin with, right? Which means winning schools that actually have smaller class sizes, mental health counselors, police out of our schools, the resources for our kids and our teachers to succeed. That's going to require a revival of rank and file union militancy and struggle and solidarity that foregrounds the demands of our students, that foregrounds demands of anti-racism and social justice. It's going to require a revival of that type of militant rank and file social justice unionism, and the revival of workplace action, of strikes and mass protests, and the kind of disruptive, at times illegal workplace activity and social movement organizing that won teachers the right to unionize in the first place. So yeah, that's where we're at in New York. Though that is sort of a picture of what public education looks like, and hopefully gives some sense of what teachers are doing at the front lines to resist the ruling class's abandonment of our schools, of our teachers, of our kids, and to also put forward a vision of the kind of schools that our communities deserve, and hopefully some kind of strategy for how to get there. So I hope this has been helpful for comrades. I hope folks can generalize some of these lessons to what's happening wherever you are. And in struggle and solidarity, we still have a world to win. And I'm glad we can collaborate with one another. Stay safe and take care, comrades.